Hello, I'm Ronnie, and welcome to today's podcast. We're diving deep into a topic that affects not only our nation's history, but also our future: criminal justice reform. In this episode, we'll discuss why it's critical to get involved in criminal justice actions, the ongoing systemic racism that filters through the justice system, and why we can no longer afford to stay silent about the injustices facing Black and marginalized communities. We'll also be highlighting specific actions you can take to be part of the change we desperately need. Thank you for joining me today. To truly change the landscape of justice in this country, we must take action. Too often, we think that the responsibility of reform lies solely in the hands of lawmakers or activists. But the truth is, it's a collective effort. We all must stand together to demand a system that values equality, dignity, and human rights. The murder of Robert Brooks, a tragic and senseless killing, is a stark reminder of how our system fails Black individuals. His death, like so many others, exposes the lethal consequences of a systemic injustice. A system where Black lives are often seen as disposable and where the state apparatus perpetuates violence rather than justice. These aren't isolated incidents. They reflect a much larger pattern of state-sponsored violence, including the beatings, rapes, and murders that we often hear about in the news but are rarely addressed head on. It's critically important that those of us who have survived the criminal justice system join the fight for change. Our voices and experiences matter. If we had endured the system's injustices, we must stand up for those who continue to suffer within. Our fight is for justice for the living, the incarcerated, and those who have been lost to it. This is why it's crucial to get involved. Every time we raise our voices, every time we show up to a protest, every time we call out a legislator, we chip away at a system that has hurt so many for far too long. The reality of a systemic racism in our criminal justice system cannot be ignored. From the moment a person of color enters the system, whether through arrest, conviction, or incarcerated, they face obstacles that their white counterparts may never even have to consider. The bias is entrenched at every level in the police force, the courtroom, in sentencing, and behind the prison gates. Black men and women are disproportionately convicted of crimes, and when sentenced, they often face harsher punishments. Studies show that Black defendants receive longer sentences compared to the white individuals convicted of similar crimes. The pattern doesn't just stop at sentencing. It continues in our correctional facilities where individuals are subjected to discrimination, abuse, and neglect. Prisons today are not designed for rehabilitation or second chances. They are often places where racist policies and practices thrive, where overcrowded conditions and a lack of resources contribute to further harm. We cannot continue to ignore the fact that these facilities in some cases have become modern-day institutions of cruelty, disproportionately affecting Black bodies. And these are the same institutions that have allowed for lynchings to be covered up with little to no consequences. It's essential to acknowledge the grim reality faced by individuals in the criminal justice system. The system doesn't just incarcerate people, it often sets them up for failure. Once individuals, particularly black men and women, are incarcerated, they are subject to a system that perpetuates recidivism. The lack of access to adequate rehabilitation programs, the trauma of being incarcerated in a hostile environment, and the barriers to reentry into a society create a vicious cycle that's hard to break. We see people leaving the prison system only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of rearrest, reincarceration, and repeated sentencing. This isn't a failure of the individual, it's a failure of a system designed to strip away opportunity. When someone is released from prison, they are expected to rebuild their lives, often with little to no resources, support, or understanding from the outside world. This contributes to high recidivism rates and reinforces the notion that certain individuals, especially black individuals, are irredeemable. This is why we must demand a reimagining of the criminal justice system, one that is truly rehabilitative, that values second chances, and that ensures every person, regardless of race, has the opportunity to rebuild their life and contribute to society. It's also important to note that these acts of violence within the criminal justice system are not limited to men's facilities. In fact, these acts of violence occur just as frequently and brutally in women's facilities as well. Women behind bars face systemic abuse from correctional staff and also civilian staff. From physical assault to sexual violence, the abuse within women prisons are often overlooked or ignored. These women are not only dealing with the trauma of incarceration, but also with the unique vulnerabilities that come with being women in a largely male-dominated system. It is critical to recognize that the issues of violence and abuse affect all genders. Women of color, in particular, are subject to a double burden of racial and gender bias violence. The lack of adequate oversight, resources, and accountability within these facilities leaves them vulnerable to exploitation and mistreatment. We must fight for justice and safety for incarcerated women just as vigorously as we do their male counterparts. And we cannot forget that when someone is sentenced to prison, whether male or female, they are not being sentenced to be being beaten, raped, or murdered by correctional staff. But for far too long, many incarcerated people, this has been their harsh and brutal reality. No person should ever be subjected to such violence, but it continues to happen because of the lack of accountability and oversight within our prison system. It is clear that the criminal justice system cannot continue on its current path. We must push for an overhaul that prioritizes human dignity, fairness, and rehabilitation over punishment. In a society that claims to value equality, we must ensure that everyone, regardless of race, background, or circumstance, receives fair treatment. We need to advocate for systemic change, focusing on reducing radical disparities in the system and ensuring that everyone has access to fair trials, reasonable sentences, and support upon release. This means advocating for policies that ensure rehabilitation, addresses racial discrimination, and challenge the practices that filter through mass incarceration. To begin addressing these issues, I'm calling on the Attorney General's office once again and all local, state, and federal officials to commit to unannounced visits to all correctional facilities. These visits are essential to holding the system accountable and ensuring that inhumane treatment doesn't go unnoticed. We must act now to ensure that people behind bars are treated with the dignity and humanity they deserve. But Reform isn't just something we talk about. It's something we can actively work towards today. On January 28th, we have an opportunity to make our voices heard. Join us for the Parole Justice Advocacy Day in Albany. We'll be gathering from across the state to uplift our vision for a justice system rooted in fairness, safety, and reuniting families. We'll be rallying for the passage of the elder parole and fair and timely parole bills, which would ensure that individuals, especially elderly prisoners who have shown remorse and rehabilitation, are given a fair opportunity for release. It's time to pass laws that reflect the true values of justice, fairness, mercy, and the right to a second chance. On January 28th, transportation will be provided, so there's no excuse not to join us. Let's come together and raise our voices for change. Together, we can create a future where justice is not only a word, but a reality for everyone. In closing, I want to thank each and every one of you for listening today. The criminal justice system has failed too many for too long, but we have the power to change that. As the late great John Lewis often said, we must get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Now is the time for us to take action, to speak out and to show up for those who have been silent for far too long. So as you reflect on what we've discussed today, I encourage you to get involved. Attend rallies, write to your legislators, demand accountability, and advocate for those who are voiceless. Together we can make a difference, and together we can bring about the change our country so desperately needs. Thank you for joining, and remember, justice cannot be denied in 2025. Stay strong, stay determined, and stay in good trouble. We appreciate you tuning in today. If you're inspired to take action, please visit the links in Releasing Aging People in Prison website or the Freedom Unshackled website, where you will find the link for our Parole Justice Advocacy Day and how you can support criminal justice reform. Stay informed, stay active, and together we'll build a fair future for all. Take care, and we'll see you next time.